Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Feldman. I'm a senior counselor with Legend Labs, and I'd like to welcome you to this conversation on crisis and issues management during the era of the coronavirus. It features my colleague, Jeff Hunt, who is the author of Brand Under Fire, Crisis Management in the Digital Age. And Jeff and I have worked together for, I guess, about 12 years now in places as varied as Fukushima, dealing with the nuclear crisis, Aruba, dealing with the disappearance of two American women, Penn State, dealing with the Sandusky matter, and lots of other crises in between. And unsurprisingly, any number of our clients are currently uh, seeking our advice on coronavirus. And so we'd like to share some of our thoughts on that with you today. Also joining us is my colleague, Christina Rubino, who will help open up the floor to your questions once we're probably about 15 minutes or so in. So Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Bill, and I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. Thought I might just start off with a few high-level observations that certainly would apply to most crises, but I think are particularly applicable during this unprecedented, which is a word we hear used a lot for this crisis that we're all enduring or going through. And one of the things that I said, from the outset about 6 weeks ago is that I thought there was an excellent opportunity during this period where we're kind of like freezing life as we know it from a business perspective to really earn what I called great will, not goodwill, but great will with all of your key constituents. And I would say that you begin with the inside. There was an old brand cereal commercial going back to the late 70s. It said, take care of the inside and the inside will help you take care of the outside. And I think that could never be more true than today. Now, how do you build great will with all these key constituents? I think there are three things that you need to be thinking about. Number one is surprise, obviously in a positive way. Number two, delight. And number three, engage. So surprise, delight, and engage all of your key constituents on the path to building great will. What should you not do? And I'm sure you've all experienced some organizations that are doing this, and you probably have the same reaction that I've had. This is not a good time to be selling almost anything because people really just aren't in the mood to be getting sales-oriented messages, in this day and time when they've got 1,000 other things that are on their minds. So selling, active selling, I would say, is not a good thing to be doing right now, but building great will and demonstrating that you truly care about your key constituents, again, whether it's your employees, your customers, your prospects even, government officials, city, state, local, national, and frankly, any other key constituent that you would normally engage. So that's sort of at a high level, and I know that's very high level. So perhaps, Bill, as we move through our discussion, we can dive a little deeper and give some examples of what great will looks like.
Yeah. Jeff, you and I both saw a funny cartoon in which someone is sitting at their computer and says that some company that I gave my email address to 3 years ago just emailed me to tell me that they're with me during this difficult time. And of course, all of us are being bombarded by those kinds of messages. So what's the answer to cutting through that clutter and really doing something that's meaningful?
Yeah, I think early on, particularly in the first, let's say, 2 weeks of this, we saw organization after organization coming out with what I call these hygiene memos about what they're doing to adjust their operations during this difficult period. And frankly, most of it was inwardly focused. Here's what we're doing to adjust, our operations. And those got old pretty fast. And then we had a shift to the public service announcement, and so you had organizations in their own ways saying, stay healthy, socially distance. And, those got old too, frankly. Just there's so many times that you want to hear socially distance, even if it's coming from like some superstar, football player or baseball player. Thankfully, I think we started to move into what I would call more engaging behavior, more engaging activity. And so think about it this way. If you're a mother or father, you're at home now because you can't go to work. You've got 2 or 3 kids. couple of them are of school age. You've got a lot on your mind right now. You're likely homeschooling the children. And when you're not homeschooling them, you got to think about what do you do to keep them busy, right? And what do you do to kind of keep your own self, sane during this period? So a good example of what I would call really productive engagement, we saw some sports teams doing. In fact, I wrote a piece for the Sports Business Journal about this, but where you have athletes not just saying, stay safe, socially distance, but you actually have an athlete, talking to a little leaguer, read the 8-year-old or the 9-year-old that's in the house playing softball or playing baseball, and giving them some practical things that they can do in the house to practice bunting, for example, or to practice fielding a ball, but really practical things that, really engage, these young kids. And in effect, put a relief valve for the parents. So that would be one example of what I'm talking about. You know, Lululemon is a very popular brand. A lot of people wear it. I actually wear it. Now's not a good time for Lululemon to sell me sweatpants. Now would be an excellent time for Lululemon to give me some very practical, yoga classes, or give my kids. And I don't know if they are, they may be, but that's an example of what I'm talking about. Productive, engaging content and exercises that go beyond just the PSA.
One of the things that we've often counseled our clients on is the importance of being able to manage a crisis remotely, that you may not have access to your office, you may not be able to get your team together in the kind of typical command center that we would ordinarily suggest using. How can companies do that now, and how important will it be for them to develop that kind of remote capability?
I think a lot of organizations are learning a lot about their readiness, um, and their vulnerabilities, when it comes to communications of all forms. I think they're probably seeing some significant gaps in their technology, their adoption of technology, even though technology like this, Zoom, right, is very easy. When you scale it to an enterprise, there are a lot of intricacies. And as we all know, Zoom is having some privacy issues. So I think that, this is a really good time. Oftentimes when we're in the crisis preparedness mode, we do simulations, and we use those simulations to sort of pressure test systems. And we also look at management behavior, just to kind of see how it holds up under pressure. Well, this is a real, this is not a simulation, it's real. And I think what smart organizations will do once we get, to the back end of this, is by the way, they should have already isolated a crisis team. That would be one of the key pieces of advice we would have given early on, that's managing this. But at some point when they get to the back end of this, I think there's a call to bring the leadership together, and probably spend a full day debriefing how we did during this crisis, what worked, what didn't work, where were we vulnerable. Um, and so I think that will produce a lot of learnings that will help them prepare for future crises. I think one other thing, by the way, this is a very practical thing, but we really saw how powerful video is, and other forms of creative and engaging content. So the days of writing these long, terse emails, whether it's to employees or to customers that are dense and, really are kind of over. People just don't want to engage that way. They want to engage in a conversation, much like we're doing now. And video is proving to be by far, the single most effective way to communicate and to engage.
How many of those changes do you think will be permanent, particularly as they relate to communications? It seems certainly that video is one of them. What do you think about that?
Well, we've been talking about the importance of rich content now for the last, 5 or 6 years, as we moved into this digital age. One of the things I talk about in the book is that these 5 key principles, and one of them is creativity. And so what you have to really understand is that you're competing with all forms of media, to really kind of tell your story. And so if you think about it in that way, then you have to understand that, whether it's an employee or a customer or anybody else, there's 1,000 other things they could be doing. And so even if it's on a common topic that's affecting everybody, like the coronavirus, right? I'm going to tune in to somebody that gives me, brain snacks, you know, rich content, easy to digest content, probably delivered over video or simple infographics, far more than I will, again, this dense, language, often legal, to avoid liability. So I'm hopeful that this is going to really awaken people to the need to really think about refreshing their content across the board, um, and really understand that they need to have digital assets prepared to help them explain their position against vulnerabilities that they know lie ahead. So, for example, if you're an enterprise of virtually any size and you haven't thought about the possibilities of a data breach, you must be on another planet. So if that's the case, then what are you going to be doing to explain your position on the data breach? Is it going to be just some long memo? Or are you going to have really robust and rich content to explain it?
We often talk about how crises tend to happen in bunches of three. Sometimes it's because they're related. For example, the Navy issue, where a crisis that began involving the coronavirus turned into something else entirely and resulted in the Navy acting secretary's resignation. Other times, they're completely unrelated. An earthquake or a tornado needs to be managed even at the same time that you're managing the coronavirus. How can companies protect their ability to manage multiple crises at a time like this?
Well, first off, I think that the coronavirus is probably masking a lot of crises that otherwise would be on the top of the front page or the lead of the newscast. So I'm convinced that even though we have a lot of people not, working at this moment, there were a lot of crises that were already in motion. Sexual harassment. I guarantee you there were already people that were on the front end of a data breach. And so you're right. We've always said that one of the characteristics of crises is they tend to go into a mode of escalating flow of events where, you think, God, what else could happen? Well, then tonight, if you're sitting up in New York, you've got the real threat of severe storms blowing through that could knock some of those tents that you put up to care for people, with the coronavirus, right? But by the way, there's a number of other things. So I think the key thing is to understand that when you're in a crisis, you're not just vulnerable to the crisis you're in, but you're also vulnerable to a lot of other things that could potentially emerge. Now, when we see this happening in organizations, like, for example, go back last year and the year before with Uber, what we really understand is that there are cultural issues that really allow these types of crises to occur and to repeat themselves. And so this is a good time to examine culture, to really kind of have a clear understanding. And the best way I know to do it is to really think about if you could imagine what life would be like on the other side of this crisis or any other crisis. And you start to think about what are the perceptions that we would want people to have of our organization, whether it's our employees, our customers, or anybody else, of how we managed, how we handled this crisis. The extent to which you get alignment of the senior leadership. And by the way, what that does is it very frequently drives an understanding about the importance of authenticity and an understanding about the importance of transparency. I always say that if we get, and Bill, you and I have both experienced this, but if we're in a boardroom and we are arm wrestling the legal group over if we will disclose, we probably have already lost. Okay. In this day and age, the question is not if we will disclose, but it's when and how. Because if we're arguing, you go back to what I said about the nanosecond news cycle, by the time you get through with the internal debate, the train's already left and you're now put in the position of having to kind of respond and catch up. The narrative's already kind of run away from you.
Although it's one of the things that we know from dealing with this particular issue with some of our clients is that there are also significant legal and privacy concerns that constrain what can be disclosed. For example, student illnesses, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you don't mind, Bill, I want to come back to engagement and I gave the example of, what a Lululemon might do, or what you know, another active brand might do. I want to talk about a couple of other examples, because I think really illuminating this in the most practical way possible would probably be most helpful for the people that are on the call. So, by the way, that's my wife cooking. Hold on one second. It's hard to. New normal. Back, sorry. But I want to give an example. I think we probably have a number of people, on the line or on the call or in the conversation who come from educational institutions, because we do a lot of work with higher ed. And I think there's an excellent opportunity right now and moving forward for educational institutions, particularly big public institutions, to really demonstrate their relevancy to society and to the communities and to the states in which they live. So let me give you an example. If you pick the university, let's call it a state institution, and you're trying to figure out the engagement strategy, right? Obviously, if you have a big health sciences center and you've got researchers who are actively looking at vaccines and other ways to counteract the virus, that's important. And that's certainly something that you would want to make sure people understand, that you're giving it your all. But beyond that, if you think about it, you probably have in some of these schools an education department where you're training future teachers. How cool would it be to engage that faculty in helping parents who are now at home homeschooling their kids with some of the tricks of the trade for the best way to homeschool? And that would be a huge value add. That would be content, again, that would surprise me, it would delight me, and it would be very practical. Well, let's go further. What if you have a physiology department, right, where you're training future, people to be physiologists and so forth? Well, what if they were to be creating content that kind of gives you exercise routines that you can do at home? And so you can go all the way through. What if I have a psychology department that's telling me how to deal with anxiety? And I put all this content together in one place on a hub that says X, Y, and Z University is doing its part to really engage and to help our community, be it the local, where the campus is, but more broadly, all of our former alums and constituents. And so if you think about it, it's a new way to really elevate the relevance of the institution in the minds of a lot of key constituents, including the legislators, by the way, who are often signing the checks or, agreeing for the funding of the institutions. So again, I think, if you have regardless of what organization you're in or what type of organization you're in, the brainstorming and the creativity that I would be doing is, how can we surprise, delight, and engage with content that's not selling, but is truly delivering a value add benefit?
Jeff, I just want to chime in. We're about at the 18-minute mark. So Bill, if you have another question, we can go there, and then I can dive in.
Well, I have a few more, but why don't we open up the floor to questions if there's anybody else who would like to ask one, and then I'll come back.
Sure. I have one that came in, which would be, I guess, I've seen some CEOs deliver messages on video that are not very compelling. In a crisis of this magnitude, does the CEO have to be the face of the company?
I would say absolutely not. And in fact, one of the things that, now in some cases they do, but what people really want, I go back to, those 5 key principles, and I speak to authenticity. So what people want is not an institutional voice, okay? They want a conversation, and they want the conversation to be with the expert. Now, if the CEO is the expert, so for example, if we're talking about, the viability of United Airlines to deliver, customer service, probably should be the CEO. But if we're talking about, another type of organization, and we're going to get beyond the fact that, we, really believe in our customers and we're taking care of our employees, if we're going to get beyond that, then again, I would want to speak to the expert. I want to hear from the expert. Doesn't mean that the CEO couldn't put a wrapper on it, but the CEO is not always the best person to speak on behalf of the company. And we know that, in regular crises as well. People really in this day and age don't like that sort of top-down hierarchy of communications and messaging. They like to get to the experts. It's my expert.
I think another great one would be, what should we be doing today to get ready for the return to normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, as I said earlier, we're probably now at the point in this crisis where I would be isolating the go or the comeback team. And one of the things I want to really emphasize here, and I didn't talk enough about it at the front end, is the opportunity to really engage your employees. Your employees right now are full of anxiety, no matter how secure they may feel, and the assurances that you've given them. They've got just tons of anxiety around this, whether it's from their own family members, directly affected by this. And so keep them busy. And how do you keep them busy? Engage them and engage them in helping you plan for the future. So I would be really kind of isolating the go forward team, the comeback team, whatever you want to call it. And I would be from the bottom up, bringing ideas to the forefront of what we're going to do and how we're going to stage it, recognizing that you can just put a D-Day on when that might be, because none of us know. But there's no reason why you couldn't be planning for it today. And again, against all key constituents. So your employees, your customers, and the like. And so, I would say the next week, 2 weeks, you really need to have a pretty well-tuned plan ready, because we're probably in a window now where it could be 2, 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks. But most people think whether it's a gradual return to normalcy or whether it's this, flip the switch, we're back on, we are going to start to get to some new levels.
Got it. I think we have time for about one more question, and then I'll hand it back over to you, Bill. So last one would be, what are some key considerations for communicating to furloughed employees returning to their jobs?
This furloughed employee issue is a really complex issue because, the government and the stimulus bills went out of their way to try to protect and preserve the employee-employer relationship. The problem is they didn't do it fast enough. And so companies that were really looking at their cash basis were forced to do furloughs, because they had no other option. Well, now, we're starting to see, particularly in the small business space, the stimulus kick in. My hope is that on the way out, meaning when they furloughed them, they were delivering the right messages on the front end, which is to say that, this is a decision that we really did not want to have to take. You're an extremely valued person, and this is really not something we wanted to do. And then this is kind of how we're going to approach this. And I would be updating those people regularly. That's another thing that I would say, particularly with your internal constituents, is I would not underestimate the need to over communicate. Okay, I'll repeat that. I would not underestimate the need to over communicate. Now I'm talking about with your employees. Customers can get annoyed if you over communicate. But I think your employees, what I'm seeing is kind of a standard is, 6 or 7 of the organizations we're working with is there's some form of a video message that it tends to be going out on a Friday. For some reason, a Friday tends to sort of set up well for the weekend. Most of them are ending with, by the way, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out directly to me, meaning not through some HR channel, but directly to me. And then on Monday or Tuesday, they are coming back with probably a written piece of communications that says, thank you. Here are the 4 or 5 most, prominent questions that I've received since the video on Friday. And here are the answers to the best of our ability.
Well, the one question I think I would like to ask before we wrap up is also very much about the future. And that is, as you were saying, Jeff, there's a strong likelihood that when we go back to work, it's going to be in the environment of a significant degree of uncertainty. Won't be a vaccine yet, and so forth. And so employees in particular, along with customers, are going to have a significant level of anxiety. And there is an obvious interplay here between some HR decisions and how they're communicated But what do you think companies ought to do to help employees in particular cope with that anxiety? For example, we've seen one of our clients bring on board a medical doctor with a master's in public health to provide advice and to let employees know that the company is getting expert advice. What would you recommend?
I would recommend that you crowdsource your future. What do I mean by that? Nobody will be better prepared to help you figure out the new operating environment than your own people, if you listen and if you engage and if you create the opportunity. So what I would be doing is, letting them come in to the planning process and say, let's build the future together. And so I would be crowdsourcing, ideas around what the future workplace needs to look like. What are the safety measures that we need to take? So that's the first thing I would do. Obviously, I would also be calling in experts. So I wouldn't just rely on, gut reactions from my employees to tell us what safe and healthy looks like. I would have some expert advice like our client that you referenced did, which I think was very effective. But I think if you handle this right, you really have an opportunity to recharge your culture. Somebody, I think it was President Obama's former chief of staff said, never let a good crisis go to waste. I hate the expression, candidly, but, I think in this case, it's right. I mean, if you think about what life is going to look like on the other side, and I said you asked yourself that question, how do you want to be perceived? I would think you'd want your employees to be saying, I really admire the way in which our company, went through this. I particularly am very gratified by the way in which they kept me informed. And I'm most gratified by the way in which they engage me in helping to think about and to create the new environment that we're going to work in together to best serve our customers and so forth. So yeah, that's a great opportunity in my view.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Christina, and thank all of you who participated. I hope you found it was worthwhile. I would invite you to go to the website www.brandunderfire.com, where you can follow Jeff's blog on this and other subjects. So thank you again for coming, and stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.